Happy to have everyone here with us. Good afternoon. Welcome to the North Carolina Coalition for Alternatives to the Death Penalty webinar, 20 Years with No Executions, What Have We Learned? I am Noel Nickle. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the executive director of the coalition. We are a statewide coalition of 27 partner organizations now and growing. We are collectively working to end the death penalty and advance a vision of justice that addresses harm rather than perpetrates it. Today's webinar is the first of our 3-event series marking 20 years since the last execution in our state. Thank you for joining us at this critical time in our movement's history, when 18 months ago, Governor Roy Cooper commuted 15 death sentences, and yet we still have the 5th largest death row in the nation. A time in our movement's history when last fall, North Carolina passed a law to expand the methods and hasten the resumption of executions. And yet last week, the governor of Ohio called for an end to the death penalty in his state. And recently, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled an increasingly common method of execution, hydrogen gas, to be cruel and unusual. It is indeed a time when we feel an increased sense of urgency here in our state, and yet we hold great hope. Our panelists, whom I will introduce in a moment, will help us consider what all this means and what we have learned during this significant time of 2 decades with no executions. These advocates and experts have truly helped shape our state's death penalty landscape over the last 2 decades. I have a couple of questions for each of them, and then we'd like to hear from you, our participants, our attendees. And I'll just note that today's format is a little unusual for NCCADP. If you've been to our events before, you know we're very interactive. So to limit you to just that little Q&A function feels a little silencing, but it is so we can have plenty of opportunity to hear from our speakers. We do invite you to use the Q&A function, share your questions at any time, and then at the end of our time, close to the end of our time, Liv will bring those questions back to our panelists. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Seth Kotch, attorney Henderson Hill, and death row exoneree and homicide survivor family member Alfred Rivera, whom there he is. Okay. Unfortunately, Representative Fernetta Alston let us know this morning that she doesn't have just one, but she actually has 2 committee meetings at the same time. So she's not able to be with us. But we will hopefully hear from her at another upcoming 20th anniversary event. In addition to these brief bios, I want you to know that there are more detailed bios and information about our speakers on our website, which I should say early and often is nccadp.org. And we have a 20th anniversary tab where you can see full bios. So I will begin with an introduction for Dr. Seth Kotch. He is an associate professor in the Department of American Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He conducts research in modern American history, especially the social history of criminal justice. His book, Lethal State, A History of the Death Penalty in North Carolina, was published by the UNC Press in 2019. The Center for Death Penalty's landmark film, Racist Roots, which NCCADP has shared widely across the state, is based on Seth's research and published work. His new project, which I'm interested to hear about at some point, is called Leviathan, and it is a history of the death penalty in the American South. In the past, Seth has taught incarcerated students at several North Carolina prisons, and now he is the faculty director of the Correctional Education Program at UNC. Welcome, Seth. Attorney Henderson Hill is the co-founder and co-director of Redress North Carolina, a Charlotte-based community-wide initiative to unwind decades of retributive policies and refocus the administration of criminal justice. But this is only a very small part of Henderson's decades-long work. His past leadership, often in founding roles, include the following agencies and organizations: the ACLU, the civil rights law firm Ferguson Stein Chambers, the Eighth Amendment Project, the Federal Defenders of Western North Carolina, and the NC Death Penalty Resource Center, which became the Center for Death Penalty Litigation. While at CDPL, Henderson was instrumental in the passage of North Carolina's Racial Justice Act. Tragically, he represented clients on North Carolina's death row who have been executed. I'll add Henderson is a valuable participant in our death penalty strategic working group, and he serves on our advisory circle. And increasingly, he enjoys his role of grandfather. Alfred Rivera. Mr. Rivera was born in Brooklyn, New York, but he has deep roots in Puerto Rico, where his family is from. Alfred lost his father to homicide when he was a child, and his mother died only a few years later. As a young man, Alfred eventually moved to Winston-Salem, and in 1997, at the age of 25, he was wrongfully convicted for 2 murders and sentenced to death. Thankfully, Alfred was acquitted and released from prison in 1999, but while on death row, 4 men were executed, and Alfred knew each of these men. Alfred's re-entry from death row was difficult, and just a little over a year after his release from prison, he was rearrested on drug charges. He was finally released from federal prison in 2019 under the First Step Act. Alfred was part of the first delegation of impacted people who met with Governor Cooper's staff at the beginning of our commutation campaign, which resulted in Governor Cooper commuting those 15 death sentences. Alfred is a powerful and frequent speaker for NCCADP, often serving as a panelist following a screening of the film Racist Roots. He's a member of our Survivor Family Engagement Group. Alfred lives in Winston-Salem and enjoys having contact with his 3 adult children. Welcome to all 3 of you. We are so grateful for your time, and I'm eager to get started with my questions, and then we'll hear from the audience as well. So our first question starts with one of the primary reasons that we often list for abolishing the death penalty, the fact that it is racist. All across the state, we've screened racist roots, which I've now mentioned a couple of times. And the film unpacks this fact and actually features both Henderson and Seth in the film. We know the vast majority of people convicted of murder are not sentenced to death. Issues like race of the victim and the defendant, the makeup of the jury, the leanings of the particular district attorney, all of these are among the strongest determining factors as to whether someone is sentenced to death after being charged with a homicide. Seth, would you begin for us? You wrote a whole book on the history of this subject, but would you start by setting the stage and sharing just some of the key takeaways from your research regarding North Carolina's death penalty and the racism found in it? And then what have we learned about that racism over the last 20 years?
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's an intimidating privilege, but a privilege to be on this panel with the people I'm next to, and even more so to go first. So you kind of you spoiled the answer, because the answer is that the thing that we learn about the death penalty when we research its history, just as we learn when we look at it more contemporaneously, is that it's racist. And one of the things that has changed maybe in the past 50 years is that the value of racism has been turned on its head while the system itself has not. Meaning, if you were to ask people in the 1800s here in North Carolina what the goals of the criminal justice system were, they might answer that one of them was certainly to advance the safety and security of the white race, because they deserved that safety and security. Now we don't say that out loud anymore, but the system that was set up in this particular way has endured in many ways, despite some changes. And so what we have, as historians, we are taught to think about history, in some instances anyway, as being about continuity versus change. Is this a story where there's an interruption in how we proceed as Americans, how our institutions operate, or do things generally remain the same? And I still find it shocking that the story of the death penalty is one of continuity and not change. There have been ruptures, there has been changes, but in terms of the big story that we tell going back to the 1600s. It is one of remarkable durability
Mm.
of institutions that are designed to produce discriminatory outcomes. And because they're designed in that way, the work of Alfred, the work of Henderson, is extraordinarily difficult and complicated because it involves attacking the core point of those systems and how they were set up. When I was working on my book, which is receding further and further into the past, and I feel like I need to read it to remind myself of what I said in it. Um, when I was writing about the slave period, when of course the vast majority of people executed were enslaved people, which of course reveals the willingness of a white supremacist system to harm its own engine in order to advance an ideology. About 80% of people executed between the 1600s and the Civil War, which ends in 1865, are slaves of African descent. And in the Jim Crow period, between the end of the Civil War or the end of Reconstruction um, and the Civil Rights era, basically, about 78% of people executed are African American or people of color. And I wrote in the first draft of my book that it was wild that the percentage had declined by only 2 points. Um, that the racism was that concrete. And one of the reviewers wrote back and corrected me, and they said, in fact, it's not a statistically significant difference. 2% isn't statistically significant. So I changed the claim in my book in response to that accurate claim, but it was actually even more surprising to hear from someone else reflecting back upon me that, in fact, between the slave era, when our society, economy, and culture is organized around enslavement of African American people, between the slave era and the Jim Crow era, in fact, basically the same story was true. That this was a discriminatory system that was set up in order to discriminate, and it was continuing to do so at basically the exact same rate. So that continuity remains surprising, and that is, I think, one of my biggest takeaways. Um, One of my takeaways from the more recent 20-year period, which mirrors a period in the 1960s when we also had no executions. Of course, we haven't had executions in 20 years. Um, in North Carolina in the 1950s, we started to see a decline, a sort of what we could call organic decline, but it was actually a jury response to new rules that allowed them to impose fewer death sentences. North Carolinians, even the majority white North Carolinians who sat on juries, because juries were generally kept white, they were not clinging so much to the death penalty that they felt the need to give it all the time. And so we have a dwindling number of executions. There's a final execution in 1961, and then the punishment just goes unused. There was a kind of quiet referendum on it. The public was not in an outrage. Politicians were not in an outrage. They did not treat it like something that had to be addressed right away for matters of public safety and comfort. And we've had, I think, to some extent, until recently at least, a similar incidents in the past 10, 20 years where there has not been a huge outcry. People have not been demanding safety with the death penalty. What changed in the early 1970s was the Supreme Court issued a number of decisions that Southerners were told were interfering with their way of life. Roe v. Wade, legalizing abortion, a decision keeping prayer out of public schools, for instance. We have busing decisions that come a little bit later. And so there's a new narrative that emerges that the Supreme Court's action pausing the death penalty uh, is part of a suite of interference with the will of the people that has to be addressed immediately. And so we get a culture war that fires up. And I think we've seen that in recent months here as well, when there's been a long period of kind of placidity, people not necessarily feeling like their daily lives have gotten worse because we no longer have an operating death penalty, until a flashpoint allows opportunistic politicians to make changes to the law that, in fact, we've seen from recent data do appear to be making us and people in jails and prisons less safe as well. So I've already gone on longer than I intended to, but I think that question of continuity, I think, is really meaningful to me. And I think the way in which sometimes the public, which uh, public data on opinions is difficult to measure because you have to answer questions in very specific ways. But the public did not seem in the 1960s and did not seem in the 2010s, for example, to be roaring to get this punishment back. And that opens big questions about what it's for. And I think that the initial answer to your question answered that as well. It is in order to keep our caste system strong.
Mm. Thank you so much. Thank you for setting that context. Thank you for bringing in some of the other relevant themes and social justice issues and concerns. How we land in this time, in this state, I think having that kind of analysis is really important for the broader understanding. So thank you for setting that context for us. Henderson, we're going to go from big picture to somewhat more narrow. You have been so instrumental in shining a bright light on the systemic racism of the death penalty in our courts, particularly representing clients seeking relief through North Carolina's Historic Racial Justice Act. I hesitate to frame your question as what have we learned? Because clearly many Black Americans, Black North Carolinians have known full well for a very long time about the racism of the death penalty and more broadly the criminal legal system. But I wonder if you would share whatever you would like, of course, but also including how has the Racial Justice Act litigation shaped what we've learned about racism and the death penalty in our state?
Thank you, Noel. First, I guess I'd like to begin my remarks with a point of personal privilege. Uh, when we talk about 20-year anniversaries, the instinct is to be celebratory and to acknowledge that something, good has happened and it should be a source of joy. And while there are good aspects to it, many of us just feel traumatized by the thought that folks who were friends of ours, clients of ours, associates of ours, were executed. And when I think about 20 years since the last execution, my mind runs immediately to Elias Sirianni, who 19 years ago was executed. It's sort of that feeling that the question was asked, how would it feel for the family of the last soldier killed in Vietnam? It's good that the war is over. It's good that there's been a cessation of executions, but it doesn't remove the trauma that many North Carolinians are walking with every day of their lives. And I'm honored to be on this panel with Alfred, and I won't go into that story, but Alfred and I have shared a friendship with Daoud Abdullah Muhammad, David Jr. Brown. And the two of us are traumatized by that execution. And, because that happened more than 20 years ago, it has receded from a lot of memories. But there are a lot of North Carolinians who are walking around with those tragic memories. I think as I go further into my remarks, I really want to pick up on this theme that Seth started with. And that's the continuity of the death penalty. I mean, when you talk about the Racial Justice Act, legislated, I think in 2009, the study started in 2010. It's been litigated for 14 years, since then until the Supreme Court made this remarkable ruling. And there's been so many levels of appeals, it would make your it would make your head spin to track all of the legislative changes, the jurisprudential track through the appellate process, and now the sort of political track that it's on. And by political, we're including less the legislature, but the North Carolina Supreme Court's approach to resolving the fundamental concerns that were raised with the Racial Justice Act. And again, just to sort of put a bow on this last point, this political point between the legislature and the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court. Here in Charlotte, we suffered as a community a tragic loss in 2015, the killing of a young, delightful lady on the light rail system. Within weeks of that killing, the legislature acted without any data, without any reflection, without any consultation with the trial court judges, with the trial bar with the state prosecutors, and they just sort of cobbled together a legislative response that threw all sorts of wrenches into an already poorly operating justice system. So you make a system that is bad, and many would say broken, you make it worse. And I think that's not where you begin the conversation about the death penalty, but it's a recent current commentary on why there's such frustration when we sit and talk about the death penalty as if it's a policy that somebody is doing some social science research on what the goals are, what the costs are, what the costs of community are, the impact on public safety. One would hope that politicians sort of have that as part of the process, when in fact the process is very ugly and it has very little to do with achieving public safety. I think one thing that I would find celebratory about the 20 years is the work of Seth Kotch, the work of Brian Stevenson. We know just so much more about the period between the 1900s, the Black Codes, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights era, and the modern death penalty. Yeah, that just was not information that was in currency in the community, or really among academics and scholars and people with more than average, political interest and acumen. Yeah, I counted myself as one of those folks, but when I read Seth's book and got a history of the development of the Department of Corrections, the Department of Transportation, the use of chain gangs and road crews, it really, when we talk about continuity and the role of the death penalty in terms of suppressing and oppressing the African American community, the history is rife with that. And there's such an ability to have a much more granular understanding of that because of the work of Seth Kotch, because of the work that Brian has done in Alabama. Our literacy about this history is much better. But again, this word crops up again, continuity. Right now we've got an administration that's going through the national parks and stripping out exhibits that talk about the history of slavery. We've got now, an administration that is, avowedly going through the ranks of the military and clearing out men and women of supreme accomplishment and service as DEI hires. We're about to have in Charlotte a conference, this weekend, and part of it, well, the theme is restorative justice, as just as a new operating principle for the justice system. Yeah, and can we replace retribution and fear with something that promotes public safety by addressing trauma? Yeah. How do we address individuals and communities that have been traumatized by violence? Yeah. Well, number one is we don't lay on additional trauma and violence. But I raised this particular point because in preparing for this conference, I looked at some back and forth between the sheriff of Mecklenburg County and some of the legislators in Raleigh. And our sheriff is sort of, some would call a man of a healthy ego. And some would say healthier than it should be. He would say he's got a healthy ego, but he also has a sense of history. And so when he goes out as sheriff and executes 278 eviction notices every year, every month, it breaks his heart. When he goes to Southside Homes, a community in Charlotte, where he's known generations of families from that home and know of their exposure to violence and trauma. And he looks at the policies coming forward from the General Assembly and says, there's not a fit between the policies that are being promulgated and the people who have to live under the enforcement of those laws. And in one of the back and forth between some legislator from one of the rural counties in North Carolina, legislator said, well, that blue rail light rail killing would not have happened if it were not for DEI hires.
Mm-mm. Yeah. Yeah.
Really? DEI hires. When we talk about continuity and the history that Seth reveals about the turn of the 1900s and going through Birth of a Nation, all of that, all of the racial tropes, we're living through a reprise of that situation.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, I celebrate a lot of what we were able to do and aren't doing now with the Racial Justice Act. You couldn't have been in Smithfield in Johnson County during the months of that litigation through the weeks of the trial without thinking, well, something of a historic nature was happening. We were shining the light. This is no insult to Seth, because it was a really well-researched book. But, not a lot of people in Smithfield read that book. Not a lot of people in Johnson County read that book. He did a wonderful article with Robert Mostella on the history of the racial justice. But, again, Mosty's a great guy, and Seth put a whole lot of work in, but no one read it. No one outside of the legal community read it. What happened in 2 or 3 weeks in Smithfield, a lot of it was live streamed. A lot of it was covered by the local press. A lot of the local people in Smithfield were still afraid to go to court and listen to the testimony, but they followed it in the press.
That's right. Yeah.
One of our experts was a native of Smithfield, of Johnson County, of Smithfield, a scholar, top of her class in high school, went on to Duke and now professor at Emory. There was such pride in Johnson County over Dr. Crystal Sanders' return to Smithfield and her taking the stand and testifying about her history, about her father's history, Nate Sanders. You could see in the Black community pride as they were talking about that history, even though they weren't all that anxious to demonstrate that in the courthouse. Mm-hmm. And people who, history is written on the skins of Black people. Someone said that, it's written somewhere. But that may be true, but what we don't know from that history are the multiple, or what we don't often appreciate, what Black folks don't often appreciate, is just the multiple myriad ways in which their ancestors have been insulted by the laws and by the systems and the procedures in place. And that's what the Racial Justice Act enabled us to do.
Yes.
To bring in scientific evidence through well-accepted methodologies of social science. Bring in experts like Seth Kotch, experts like Crystal Sanders. Some of the mathematical experts made my head spin. But for the time that I was in the court, we had expert explainers. These were professors who were gifted teachers, and they broke that science down. And so, while we knew that the operation of the death penalty was racist, in that courtroom, it was explained with history and science how it was so, and how it was beyond repair. So I think it was a remarkable part of North Carolina history, and I'm glad I was a part of it, and I appreciate Seth for his role in it.
We are all glad you were a part of it, Henderson. Thank you so much for continuing to set that historic context and also looping in so many other important, relevant topics and stories, which I know I can always count on you for that. And hopefully we'll be able to pick back up some of those themes. I want to just touch back with a couple of the names that you just mentioned and then invite Alfred to offer some firsthand experience of his experience of being one of 11 men of color exonerated from North Carolina's death row. But you mentioned Daoud Muhammad, David Brown, Ilyas Siriani, and Alfred indeed knew those men. But before we maybe towards the end can get into talking a little bit more about those particular individuals, Alfred, would you just share with us what we should learn from your lived experience of your wrongful conviction, of you being a man of color who did, in fact, spend years on North Carolina's death row before you were exonerated?
First, thank you for having me here. And I appreciate, Henderson and Dr. Kotch's, input and work, throughout their, journeys in this fight. And, but, for me, of course, living through the experience of being on death row and being wrongfully convicted based on the racism. What I look at, is, like Dr. Kotch's history and how he showed throughout the film, for instance, Alvin Manziel's story. Things like this, these things, simple things, just like they just explained, there's many professors, many educators, teachers, people that can, are long-winded with, with statistics and things of this nature here. But when you watch a film like Racist Roots, for instance, and you see just simply that a simple man as Alvin Manziel and a racist system that's been in place since we can remember, and it simply says that because of this reason right here, regardless of the facts, the truth, just the fact of fear alone, the fact of to put you in your place, right? Just to keep you in the society in control, that racism will be used, And so when we look at my case, for instance, wrongful conviction, well, how could a person as myself be wrongfully convicted of such a horrendous crime as such? All we have to do is look at the paperwork involved, the arrest reports, and look, what was I classified as? I was always classified as a black a male, So just, even looking the way I do, maybe I look different when I was younger. I don't know, but I was always considered, just black. I guess where I was from, how I talked, or where I lived at. People I hung around. So it's always was about race. It was about the Alvin Manziel story. It was about that system that said that because of we need to put blacks in their place. We need to put non-white in their place, right? In this society, that it doesn't matter, just to send a message. So this is what we're dealing with as far as what this whole death penalty is about. Not just in North Carolina, but throughout this whole country. But for me, and knowing these guys that were mentioned, Sam Flippin, he was the last guy, executed in North Carolina. So for me, it's not a celebration. It's an ongoing, like Henderson mentioned, ongoing trauma. Things that I still deal with on a daily basis, nightly basis. So for me, it's these are the things these are the realities of what I'm, of the lived experience. Knowing that, I was um, uh, on North Carolina's death row, and that I'm sorry, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
Alfred, we can hear you. We can't see you, but
I'm
your words are powerful. Keep going. Don't stop.
I'm sorry about that.
No, no,
But
it's totally
so
fine.
and and mentioning the names of Daoud Abdullah Muhammad and David Jr. Brown and Zane Hill, people like that. I remember these guys. I knew these guys. I consider these guys, as friends and associates. I spoke with these guys about not, the traumas, but the things of, our, what the things we missed about family, about the things that, the wrongs that were done to us, the reasons, that, we were being tested by, our creator, God, things like that. These are the relationships I had. This is my lived experience. I had, the fear, have to live through the fears of knowing that, men were gonna be, executed, and I would have to live through it and sleep through it and wake up to it. So these are the things that my realities and that I still deal with. And that to this day that trauma, the trauma that still exists. I didn't know, how to I guess figure it out or what it really was. So just that me every day I find things out. So this is what trauma is. You get to see how these situations affect you in the long run. And that's what my life has been. That's what my experience has been thus far.
Thank you, Alfred. So incredibly important for us to continue to hear from people most directly impacted by this system, to amplify your voice, to sit with the harsh reality of what you are naming for us, that it hasn't gone away for you, that these were real people who were taken from you, from their families, their lives cut short by the state.
Right.
Mm. Let's circle back, Henderson. You mentioned House Bill 307, which was highly politicized, and those who pushed it forward said that they did it in the name of safety. That's one of the prevailing myths about the death penalty, is that it keeps us safe. We know that's not true. States that have the death penalty actually have a higher homicide rate than the 23 states that have abolished it. And in North Carolina, we have seen a decline in violent crime over the last 2 decades. Henderson, will you kind of circle back to maybe some of what you were sharing, and then Alfred and Seth, if you want to chime in after that. But you mentioned this upcoming conference on Saturday in Charlotte. What are you seeing really makes for safe communities instead of the death penalty, for example?
Well, part of the conversation that we're prompting in Charlotte is a broader definition of who is harmed by violence. Who's considered the harmed party? Is it the state of North Carolina? Is it the individual who might have been injured in an assault? Is it the family who may have lost someone in a murder? Is it the neighborhood who walks around in fear because of the rupture of community peace? What do you do about a community like Southside Homes, which has a high poverty rate, in some ways an insular community? And on any given day, the resident might be a witness, a victim, an accused in connection with a crime, sometimes a crime of violence. What we know from experience is that they are all survivors of trauma and violence. And none of that none of those experiences have been addressed by society at large. And so when we get an example like HB 307, which sort of tees off on an outrageous death, an outrageous rupture of peace, but one in which the participants on this weekend's conference is unfortunately, sadly used to. I mean, if you just look at Southside Homes, that community is rife with experiences of homicide and assaults and property injuries. When I talked with Sheriff McFadden about that community, he is hurt and frustrated that, as a professional for 40 years, 30 with the police department, the last decade at the sheriff's department, he thinks of himself as community centered, but he hasn't been able to work the laws that the General Assembly gives and the jurisprudence that the Supreme Court gives and figure out a way that you can both promote public safety and address a traumatized community. And so what we're doing this weekend is beginning that conversation to identify other paths, other responses to violent crime. But this notion that a General Assembly, sort of composed of the anti-democratic forces that run through our community is large, and I don't want to go into a huge political conversation about it. But when you realize that in North Carolina, the General Assembly is locked up by representatives from rural parts of the community. So when Sheriff McFadden goes up to the General Assembly and says, this law was ill-considered, it has unintended consequences in terms of how I run my jail. It has unintended consequences to how the Superior Court and the District Court conduct their dockets. It has unintended consequences on the mental health system that now has got to take a whole deeper look to a much broader category of people. We're not prepared for this. The response he gets is, well, Sheriff, I haven't heard anything about that from any of my sheriffs. Well, if you go to Surrey County, if you go to Rockingham, you may not hear that. But the 6 most populous counties in the state have railed. Their elected DAs, their elected sheriffs have said this is rupturing an already failed system. And there's nothing about the way this law was passed, nothing about the provisions that were calculated to address real problems. The sad truth about the person who assaulted Ariana is sad. But nothing about the bill would have put the courts or law enforcement in a better position to address the situation on the blue line. So I think that's a sad local example of how the pain of our community is being exploited for pure political expediency by people who really don't have the interest of the community at heart. When he says he hadn't heard from local sheriffs, he's dismissing the sheriff of Mecklenburg, he's dismissing the sheriff in Guilford, he's dismissing the sheriff in Wake. I mean, he's dismissing the sheriffs of anyone who's responsible for the care and protection of a large urban population, read a lot of folks of color. And that's here. There goes that word continuity coming up. There's nothing that different about the approach that led to Irina's law from what Seth talks about in 1906, 1911, 1920s. You got all the iconography. if I'm pronouncing the word right, all the iconography of the KKK and the racist tropes from long ago. That same vibe is what compelled Irina's law. And it's a sad echo that we resonate so well with continuity here.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I appreciate that you raised the geographic disparities in the application of the death penalty, and also that you began with talking about we have to broaden our perspective of who has been harmed and how that harm is defined, and obviously how that harm is healed and who is held account. We'll be sure and share the information about the conference on Saturday. We already have, but invite folks to show up in person in Charlotte for that. I want to just take a moment and invite our 86 participants to share questions in the Q&A. We'll get to those in just a couple of minutes. We don't have a chat, but we would welcome your comments and your questions in that Q&A function. Just because of looking at the time, I know I invited Seth and Alfred to talk about public safety, but I wonder if you would weave that response into our final question, because I think how we keep ourselves safe is one way to answer this question too. During the Racial Justice Act hearing in Johnston County, Attorney Jay Ferguson, if I'm not mistaken, made reference to Dr. King's popularized phrase, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." If I remember correctly, Jay said we have to pull that arc. And so indeed, the RJA litigation is pulling that arc. Every time someone sees racist roots, we're pulling that arc. Every time we acknowledge what really keeps us safe and work towards that, we're pulling that arc. But my question for y'all remaining is, where do you see examples of us successfully doing that, of us successfully pulling that arc towards justice? And where do we need to do more of that going forward? And Seth, I have kind of a little twist on that question for you, because you have some insight into students, into a generation that has come of age without executing people in North Carolina. Where do you see that future generation of leaders infusing justice in our communities, and how might we support them in doing that? And if you want to add into what you feel keeps that community safe, or how they define safety, you're invited to do that as well too.
I'll do my best. I do want to just briefly, if I could, say two things just in response to Henderson's comments. One is that I want to reassure the people of Smithfield that it's okay that they haven't read my book. Most people haven't. And two, I think, I wrote in that book, and so I'm spared the embarrassment of having made an error, because I wrote in the conclusion of that book, thinking that I was being eloquent, that the death penalty was kind of like a broken machine. And there's been language that's been used about, tinkering with the machinery of death. And that, of course, has been a steady theme. But I was absolutely wrong. And if I ever finish my second book, I'm going to address my error. My colleague and friend Frank Baumgartner, who's contributed mightily to this conversation as well, has written a recent book called Working as Intended. And if I had an opportunity to go back and rewrite that conclusion, instead of trying to sound like a poet, I would actually address the problem head on, which is that, in fact, the death penalty, while many parts of how it is implemented are complex and difficult and challenging, it is not broken. It is working exactly as it is intended. And all of those loopholes and straggling bits and sharp edges and corners are all part of a design. It is absolutely working as intended. And its intent has always been to terrorize. And if you want to frame that in a positive way, we could call it deterrence. Of course, we have no evidence that that works, but framed differently, we call it terror. It's, aimed at a certain group of people, and those people are often certainly people of color, but also people who are pushed to the margins. of our society in one way or another through a lack of access to education, a lack of access to healthcare, a lack of access to opportunity to work and to create a family and to disappear into the social contract, which is what most of us want to do. Many times the people who lose their lives to the death penalty are not in fact robust participants in our citizenry in the first place, not by choice, but because they have been excluded systematically from it, whether by having their right to vote denied, their right to literacy denied, their right to safety denied. Um, And I think that, again, to echo Henderson, the idea that there's not calculation about the second and third order consequences is, of course, very troubling. And I think we see that most obviously with the tinkering with the machinery, with changing our executions from hanging to electrocutions, from electrocutions to asphyxiation, from asphyxiation to lethal injection, and now maybe in new scary directions. All of these have come through handshake deals and friendships. When we switched to the electric chair, the guy who built it was just a hobbyist, um, just interested in the process. Thought it was kind of a neat project. The person who inspired our shift to asphyxiation in the gas chamber was a doctor, and he just kind of thought this was his area, and so why not? Um, the result of these shifts have generally been shock and horror, um, and that has created reactions just like the murder that took place in Charlotte. Reactions that have not thought out the consequences. You asked about students. I think I wish I had a satisfying answer here. I have had some wonderful, very engaged students, and even the most wonderful and engaged students, by virtue of the absence of executions, are not seeing this as an issue that's coming across their feeds. Um, Many of them, I was teaching while the Charlotte incident was unfolding. Many of them were not aware that that was happening unless they were from there. Some of them certainly heard about it on true crime podcasts because the deaths of white women are popular on Spotify. By virtue of them not being exposed to it with this kind of regularity, and of course, them setting aside national stories, um, they have a huge luxury in managing to avoid some of these very difficult stories, but also this creates an opportunity for us to speak to a new generation of people who do not have a sense that the safety of their daily lives is reliant on this particular kind of punishment. And who also have had the opportunity to experience lots of dialogue, whether it's with movies and films, whether it's with documentaries, whether it's with scholarship, uh, about the broader issues with our criminal justice system targeting people of color and targeting vulnerable populations. And so I think there is an openness to delinking safety and prisons, delinking safety and the death penalty, and kind of rethinking, as Henderson's doing this weekend, and of course has done for many years, thinking hard about the relationship between our criminal justice system and our sense of safety. And then, of course, that allows us to then think about um, alternatives of all kinds in how we conduct ourselves and how we form communities and who we rely on. Um, I think that there are a lot of avenues, and forgive me for those of you who have been putting things in the chat. I just managed to open it, but there's a question there about what UNC students can get involved in. I would point that to Henderson and Alfred for sure, but I will mention that this organization, the Center for Death Penalty Litigation, and others are doing frequent work in the community, and there's lots of folks to talk to. So if there are undergrad students, or Hannah, if you're an undergraduate, feel free to shoot me a note, and I'll try to connect you with some people. So I hope that answers your question. I think there's always reason for optimism, but again, as Henderson has emphasized, continuity so far is the story. We are living in a sort of temporary break, a temporary fracture. A similar temporary fracture happened in the 60s. And the big question is, can we push through this fracture even as we have these many emergencies that are making national news and apparently making our legislators feel some degree of pressure to perform as if they care about our daily lives?
Thank you, Seth. This notion of continuity and yet opportunity, I think this has become the theme of our conversation. I'm gonna shift us to some questions. I think Alfred has had to step away for just a moment. I know we have some questions from attendees. I also just want to set a little bit of a context. We know among everybody on this call that people are coming with their own experience. perhaps not a lot of experience, some of you, with talking about the death penalty. We welcome you. If this is the first time you've ever had a conversation about North Carolina's death penalty, welcome. Some of the things that have been discussed with these experts may be leaving you with a lot more questions than what we have time to cover. So for sure, join me next week for our monthly information session, which I will mention again before we sign off. But we welcome you, whether you, like Henderson, have been in the trenches battling the death penalty in North Carolina for a really long time, or whether this is the very first time you've even thought about it. Liv, you have some questions for folks to consider, I think.
Hey everyone, I have the role of just reading some of the questions that have popped into the chat, and I'm happy to pass those along. We have a question here from William saying, I recently saw something where support for the death penalty is at an all-time low, and that for the first time, approximately 52% of the polled persons opposed the death penalty. Also, violent crime is steadily declining. How can we continue to build opposition in coming days considering the judicial climate?
Great question. Seth, I know you mentioned polling, and it depends on how questions are asked. I don't know if you want to pick up on any of that, but Henderson, do you have some thoughts about judicial climate? And I'll just say there are hearings happening yesterday and today in Wake County Court, spurred along by House Bill 307.
The problem is it really is a political question, and to say that the problem is at the courts, particularly state and local courts, sort of misapprehends the larger challenge. You know, in February of 2016, I was certain that we would be looking at the end of the death penalty in North Carolina in 5 years. Justice Scalia had passed. Hillary Clinton seemed to be ascending, and we thought we had 4 or 5 votes on the Supreme Court to end it, and a Democrat would pick the next vote. Look at where we are now. I mean, we're talking about a complete reversal. So when I heard your prompt about King's comment about the arc bending towards justice, my mind went to, while he was talking about that, he was also being asked, how long? Not long. Well, not long is now a much bigger time frame. When I think about Julius Chambers, when I think about Brian Stevenson, when, 2 visionaries of different generations, but they share the same thought, that this is a multi-generational battle, and that the death penalty is one piece of a racist agenda that is now has the force of the federal government behind it. And we're looking at state legislatures in North Carolina and most of the South that are playing by the same playbook, which sort of prioritizes a return to racist policies of the past. So I think what's happening in Wake County Superior Court needs to be challenged, is being challenged. I'm proud of the work by the ACLU, the CDPL, and other committed advocates. We've got to be in that battle. But there are other battles, larger battles in November and 28 that requires the full throttle of energy and commitment. And unless we, sort of fight and push on those battles, our challenge with this racist relic is going to be difficult indeed.
Absolutely. Seth, you want to add anything?
I mean, I'm interested to see that poll. I mean, I'm not seeing the actual poll, but William emphasized that the 52% of respondents opposed the death penalty, which is strong language. In historic polling, the death penalties reached a peak in North Carolina in the 1930s as having about 60% support. But people were never asked, would they consider life without parole as an alternative to the death penalty? It was just a, do you support the idea of a death penalty for murder? And a lot of people are just going to say, yeah, because that sort of seems to make sense, or at least in the moment seemed to make sense to them. But when offered the alternative, we see the support gap tightening. And then I do believe I agree with William that I think based on the polling that I've seen recently, we are at an all-time low. Of course, we have to sort of set that fact up against the fact that we are in North Carolina and, to a large extent, federally being governed by a minority. And so it's not clear to me that a popular position, a fairly popular position, such as opposition to the death penalty or support for life without parole, which we know provides its own host of issues. The discrimination does not just vanish when you take an execution off the table, right? But to keep our conversation within the bounds of where we're at, it's not clear that that kind of support is meaningful to the people who are in charge of our state, and I think we've seen that in just in recent months. With Arena's law and the sort of absence of real discussion about its merits and an absence of bringing it to the public, we now have a kind of nationalized way of approaching a lot of these questions that involve just trying to add our weight to that arc that is being pulled, straightened as much as possible constantly by an array of powerful actors, and without people like Alfred and Henderson and their supporters and the groups they support in the state, the weight of that gentle bend would be much less significant. So how to translate a popular policy into something that brings results? It's a little bit overwhelming, and I'm glad I don't have to consider it as part of my daily life, because there is, as Henderson suggests, there is so much on the table right now in terms of survival for all sorts of communities and all sorts of individuals and families that it can be very hard, I think. And I don't envy the job of having to map a legal strategy, having to map a persuasion strategy, and having to map a social strategy. But I'd rather be mapping it from a position of relative strength, meaning a de facto moratorium, than one where we are having to devote our energies furiously to the daily threat of an execution.
No, I know we're running out of time, but you mentioned at the beginning Mike DeWine in Ohio.
Yes.
I think it's worth reading Governor DeWine's message about his decision to come out against the death penalty after 50 years of support for the death penalty as governor, as a legislator, as a senator. And one of the things he said is it does not provide public safety.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's true when the governor in Pennsylvania, Governor Wolf, issued a memo, I think maybe 6-7 years ago, when Governor Shapiro subsequently in Pennsylvania issued a memo. It's the same thing. These are people at the heads of their states. These are political leaders who are looking at social science information at polling and realize this is not related to public safety. It doesn't advance public safety, and they're making that decision. So I think there are some bright lights out there, but we are in some short-term political headwinds. Query how short-term they are, but
I appreciate the bright lights wherever we may find them. Alfred is back with us. Liv, do you have maybe one or possibly two more questions for our panelists to consider before we move to them having a brief opportunity to offer some closing thoughts?
Absolutely. We have plenty of questions, so I'll pick one here from Nathan. This is addressed particularly to Henderson. Henderson, what in your mind does it take to bridge the gap between the legislation and the unintended consequences that surface after? Whose voice, if any, is loud enough to catch the attention of policymakers?
well, I think Arena's law suggests that the oppositions of sheriffs was important. The opposition of Superior Court judges, senior resident Superior Court judges who are responsible for administering these changed timelines. They're not going to be that responsive to advocates, this legislature won't, but this law did real damage. It's possible that mental health associations might weigh in on what they're doing to the system, just willy-nilly without considering how it's going to impact an underfunded mental health system on top of poorly staffed, poorly trained law enforcement officers to deal with persons presenting in crisis. So I don't have a whole lot of hope for the General Assembly learning, but they have been willing to sit down with certain judges and prosecutors to figure out if they're able to tweak the law. The problem is that's all that's going to happen. They're going to be tweaking around the edges. And this is how a terrible system, just continues to get worse and worse and worse. I mean, they can make, one or two marginal tweaks, but it really imports bad toxins into an already diseased system. So it's not, you can't really look for improvement with this piece of legislation.
Thank you, Henderson. I'm just looking through some of the questions myself as well. Liv, do you want to bring one more question, or do you think we should move on to some closings?
I think we've gotten several questions asking generally if panelists can comment on how HB 307 may speed up the appeals of those on death row, whether we are close to executions coming back in North Carolina. So many birds with one stone with that question.
Or babies with one blanket? May I answer that question just to be succinct? And then I'm going to pass it to each of you for just a minute for closing. And if you want to weave that in, that's absolutely fine. So the two provisions in House Bill 307 that became law that we anticipate brings a sense of urgency to our work, because we anticipate that it may mean that executions will resume after this 20-year hiatus. One is the provision that any method of execution that hasn't been proven unconstitutional in another state is valid to be used here in North Carolina. And the second is this 2-year time limit for the review of all post-conviction death penalty cases. And in a follow-up email that I know Liv is going to send everyone who's registered for this webinar, we can include some more links about House Bill 307, along with lots of other information, which I'll mention in a moment. But I'm going to invite us, I'm looking at the time, we do want to finish by 1:15. And so I want to invite each of you to take just a minute to offer anything else. I love how you all have interacted with one another. Literally, while I was thinking about these questions, I thought, well, how can we frame it so that the three of you can talk with one another? And so I appreciate that you've already done that. Henderson, why don't we start with you and then go to Alfred, and then Seth, you're welcome to close us out before I offer a final closing. All right, Henderson.
Well, the most hopeful thing about HB 307 to me is that it took all of 2 or 3 weeks for the General Assembly to pass this bill. So they don't know what they did. They don't really know what the consequences are. And in some ways, it reminds me of EDPA, the federal legislation from 1994 or thereabouts. It was passed with the same intent: speed things up, speed up executions. Well, that's what EDPA was. It kind of spelled the death of habeas corpus. Well, habeas corpus has found a way to survive. It's things got bollocksed up because there were all new inconsistent principles battling other inconsistent principles. And my sense is when you put a 2-year time limit on something that's very complicated and has, just decades and generations of the legal principles and precedents to follow, it's not easy to just sort of throw that 2-year limit and expect even your friendly judges and DAs to dance to that tune. So while it's an awful piece of legislation, it's creating all sorts of trauma for friends in the advocacy and litigation community. I'm certainly pleased that here in North Carolina and across the country, we've got a much more robust litigation and advocacy community than what existed in 1994. And so the ability to identify litigation challenges and to find places where advocacy can make a difference, we're in much, much better position to do that today than we were back in the Contract with America days in 1994.
I like that hopefulness. Thank you, Henderson. Alfred, you have some closing thoughts for us.
Yeah, I would just like to say that it's because of voices like that's on this panel and the work that individuals like yourselves do. This is what gets us across to people in the state, whether it's in the courtrooms, legislation, out grassroots in the streets in the communities. It's up to us, and we've proven that in a sense, and we shed literally blood, tears and sweat. I've seen grown men cry and behind these issues, and because of the passion and their life's work. So for me, the bills and and all the politics behind it, I don't really hone in on. I know the issues, but I don't really like to get people to take down in a rabbit hole on certain things. I just want to keep it simple, knowing that the death penalty in North Carolina and America is wrong. It's racist. There's people like ourselves that we are the voices. There's people that we need to lift up and pick up and bring along with us. And these are the things that we need to be doing. And the commutations, that recent commutation, that's proof of the work. The 20 years of rambling and thinking about what to do next is proof of the work. But there's still people suffering. There's families suffering. There's victims that's still suffering, and we still have a lot of work to do. So for me, it's an ongoing thing, and I'm just ready and willing to show up, and I appreciate everything.
Thank you, Alfred. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Seth, some parting words for us.
Well, that's hard to follow. But I will just say that I am in my own mind trying to figure out what to make of this continuity. That I read an article that was published in the News and Observer more than 100 years ago that talked about it framed the death penalty as a lottery. And it basically said, there's some factors that will make you lucky or unlucky in this big lottery. And it identified those factors. It said if you're a person of color, particularly African American in that moment, if you're poor, if you're uneducated, these are the chits on your side that are going to make you less lucky. And then if you have an education and you're white and you're wealthy, you're unlikely to be executed. So we've known about these basic constitutional issues of fairness, for over 100 years, and well before then as well. There was consensus about the death penalty being slow and difficult to apply and applying only to a particular group of people unevenly. And yet somehow we have continued using it, and have continued allowing it to be used. And when I say we, of course, I'm not intending to set aside all of the work that's being done by the people in this room and elsewhere. But the broader we has shown a remarkable toleration for this kind of punishment. And I think that can feel overwhelming. However, as my fellow panelists have mentioned, there is a groundswell of opposition to the death penalty, and that opposition to the death penalty takes the form, as Alfred is saying, of a recognition of humanity, of people such as Alfred being willing to speak up for themselves and their friends and others, and of a reminder that the complexity of the death penalty is in many ways intended to cover human stories with a blizzard of paperwork and procedures such that we can no longer see the people behind them. And unfortunately, that's amplified by a media that is ravenous for blood. So I'm not an optimist as a general position, but I think that there's a lot that we see here in North Carolina that suggests that as long as people such as Henderson, Alfred, and yourself, Noel, and the people who are in attendance here keep this story alive and keep the story of the humans alive. And that includes victims of crime as well as victims of the criminal justice system. We do not need to choose one or the other. That making sure that those human stories are first and foremost will allow us both to address the death penalty with the abundant data we have, but also from an emotional perspective, because I think that's an important part of this solution. The death penalty is an angry and hurt and frustrated style of being. And I'm glad that Henderson and his colleagues will be fixing this weekend in Charlotte, and I look forward to seeing the happy result.
Thank you, Seth. I have learned so much today, and I know there are many questions that were not answered or addressed. Liv and I will take that to heart as we continue to plan programming and opportunities for us to come together for these conversations around the 20th anniversary of the last execution in our state. We're going to move right now to what you can do next, and then we will let you get back to the rest of your day. We do have 2 more events coming up. They are both in person. And so our call to action, our invitation to you is to show up with us on the actual 20th anniversary date. That's August 18th. We will have an interfaith service and a vigil in front of Central Prison. The service will be at Pullman Baptist Church in the evening on the 18th. And then the next Saturday on August 22nd, we will gather for a symposium to hear from experts, people with lived experience, with stories to tell. We hope that you will be able to join us. And we also hope that you will respond to an email that you get from Liv, an invitation to join our email list. It will also include information. I mentioned this monthly information session that I host. The next one is on Monday at 7 o'clock. And so if there were things in this conversation that you were like, I want to know more about that, come, and I will do my best to answer your question. And if I can't, I will steer you in the direction of more resources. If you are coming to this conversation today saying, what can I do? Come to the conversation on Monday, and I will have a whole host of opportunities for how you can support our work. Thank you for sharing those slides, Liv. We're going to close out. I do want to just offer deepest gratitude to Henderson, Seth, and Alfred. What I am reminded of is the diversity of voices that it takes to mobilize us to the next steps, and also the diversity of voices that it takes for us to understand where we've been. So at this unique point in history, we are both looking at what has come before us, where we are now, and what we hope fervently will be our future with no death penalty. I think that the final words that I want to offer is a special thanks to Liv for making things happen behind the scenes, to all of you who joined us for this webinar, and just a reminder that we are stronger when we do this work together. We appreciate each of you being with us today, and we look forward to continuing the work with you into the future. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day.